Welcome to More Creative. I'm your host, Ashley Wiley, and today we talk with Nick Spradlin, an audio mixer and sound designer at Defacto Sound. Throughout our conversation, Nick shares his unique background in music and how it led him from a master's in percussion performance to a career designing for films, TV, and games. We talk about how sounds are created for production, how you can manipulate viewers' emotions through sound, and much more. Being a sound designer is something I'd always said I'd like to do in a second life, so it was amazing to be able to talk with Nick about his passion and career. I hope you all enjoy this one. Nick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Of course. So, growing up, did you always have an interest in music?
Not from a very early age. I guess when I was 10 years old, I got a drum set and followed the drumming path for a very long time through music school from there. But as a young kid, I liked music and I liked the movies and I was always into the speakers and the surround sound that my dad set up in the basement and that kind of thing. I remember that from very early. And then, when I was 10 years old, I got a drum set and played all through high school and ended up going to music school, and that's how that went. And that was kind of my first career.
So you decided to pursue your education in percussion performance, is that right?
Yes, I was basically a classical percussion performance major, and I got a master's degree in it. Played in orchestras a lot, played in wind ensembles a lot, did a lot of what's called percussion ensemble or percussion group, chamber music based around unique and interesting collections of percussion and drums and all that stuff. And also on the side, I taught drumline along the way. When I was in high school and in college, I was in drum and bugle corps and always did the marching bands wherever I was going to school. I was a tenor drummer, if anybody knows how drum lines work. But then I became a drumline teacher and did that for 10 years and did that all through music school. And by the time I got to my undergraduate degree, I was focused on music. Not on sound design, not on audio post, which I do now, but I was focused on music.
So what ultimately led you to pursue your master's after you got your undergrad degree?
I think I still had the dream of being a rock star or a college professor or, just a professional player. I just wanted to pursue it. And then I got through another 2 years of my master's degree and decided to do something else. But so I would have, with the master's, I would probably have gone into assistant teaching jobs or into professional gigging, but I chose not to follow that path.
So what changed?
I guess the main thing is through the course of graduate school, I realized that I really liked all the things surrounding the music as much as the music. And so there's usually a story or imagery or history that accompanies music, especially in kind of academic music. It's never just the music itself. There's always a story to go along with it. And I really liked that. And it took me a while after I got out of grad school to finally click with that I wanted to do sound design. But it kind of felt like coming home because I realized, my favorite hobby is movies and setting up surround sound speakers in my living room and all these things. And I had done quite a bit of playing with electronically augmented pieces, where you might have an acoustic instrument and a digital processor or a computer doing something alongside. And so I was always kind of the person doing those things. And I guess that's where I transitioned from school, really, is that I realized I loved the technology stuff and loved movies, and I wanted to go back to that. And so I'm still using my musical education in terms of my ears and my knowledge, but I've just kind of let go of the performance side of it, I guess.
Wow. So how does music school develop those types of skills?
I think one thing is just timbre of instruments. Besides learning the basics between this is a flute and this is a saxophone and all that stuff, when you're in a larger ensemble or a smaller ensemble, the way that a composer can combine those different sounds and get basically an infinite palette of new sounds, or if you play it with a new technique or combine things in a new way, you get a new sound. And studying that and listening to that definitely helps me now as a sound designer. So I'm glad I went down that path. And then some more practical things too, like a lot of video is cut to music. And so the sound design needs to be able to fit into music in a musical way. And so sometimes we need to bridge that gap between what is maybe more of a practical sound, just something that's on screen happening, and what's a more cerebral or cinematic sound that needs to kind of live somewhere between sound and music. Maybe it's both.
It sounds very complex.
I guess it's maybe just obscure. It's hard to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around the different levels of sound that you need in order to create an environment. So after receiving your master's, what was the next step for you?
I spent a couple of years teaching and gigging around as a percussionist, and also started to freelance in audio post-production. And I met a lot of student filmmakers who had different projects going on and I did a lot of work for free to gain experience. And I did a lot of studying. I subscribed to Mac Pro Video and Lynda and all these things so I could get caught up on how to use Pro Tools and how to use Isotope and kind of all this standard software stuff that I was a little bit behind on. I took myself to school basically to learn that practical stuff, and then just found any project I could. Sometimes when I was still teaching marching band, they would need sound effects that they would layer into their field shows and things like that. And they were designing a full room, and they said, well, I need sounds all over the room. I can figure out how to get speakers here and there. Can you make sounds to come out of the speakers? And I said, yeah. And so that was a unique project. And I've done some stuff like that now professionally years later. I think that was many years ago. It was like one of the first few projects I did. I'm remembering that. And so I did that for a couple of years and built my reel and built my experience, and eventually applied to an apprenticeship at Defacto Sound, where I'm currently working. And I, succeeded, made it through the apprenticeship, and got brought on full time. So here I am today.
So one of your beginner positions was working as a recording engineer. Is that right?
Yeah. I did a lot of freelance music recording towards the end of grad school and for those next couple of years. And I still do it occasionally, but I interned at a recording studio. That's, it's kind of a rite of passage. I think anybody that wants to get into sound is going to do that at some point. So I interned at a commercial recording studio where they did a bunch of pop bands, country bands, rap songs, a big variety of stuff in Kansas City. And then I also interned at a large classical music festival and learned a ton and made some great friends there. Yeah, just basically doing those things in the interest of building a network, gaining experience, while also doing all the freelance gigs that I could at the time to make it.
Wow. So what does a recording engineer do? How does it differ from a sound designer?
So in terms of classical music recording, it's showing up and hanging microphones all around an orchestra or any other kind of ensemble to capture the sound of the concert. And then there's usually a mix involved where you'll take those different microphones and mix them together to make what is the record, basically. And so kind of more on the front side of production, I think, is where recording lives. And then you have some post-production when you're mixing the tracks you've recorded. When I do a project now, I get a package of a video and dialogue and maybe a few sound effects that a video editor has already selected. And then I will augment and refine those things and then add on all the new sounds that need to be added. And so now I work primarily with a sound library and editing software. And then when I do record, it's usually for props, Foley, things around the house, or some kind of unique element I may need to do the sound design. So my life before as a sound recordist was tons of microphones and lots of capturing other people's sound. And now my life as a sound designer is more editing and creating new sounds to go with other people's visuals.
So what is your method for adding sounds into your projects?
It really depends on the project. Every project is going to have a different need. I learned that from my dad, who is a graphic designer. He makes art all day long, but it's not his art. It's art for somebody else,
right.
art according to somebody else's vision. And as a sound designer, my life is a lot like that. So every project will come in and it already has a vision. They want to tell a certain story or they have a certain angle, and I need to tell that story the best that I can. If I'm doing something like a short film, I did one recently and it was about a former coal miner, and he had lived this really hard life. And visually, it was shot with like these very dramatic shots, and the color on it was very dramatic and extremely moody and really kind of moving. And so from that, I decided I wanted to go a little bit more impressionist with the sound design. And so there's, of course, the sound of some things you see on screen, but the soundtrack of that really ended up being dominated by whooshes and rumbles and more ethereal sounds that created a mood and a feeling for this story rather than literally, you see somebody sitting on a couch and they move, you put the sound of their shirt in. That wasn't really what this short film needed. And so I felt that film needed that approach, and they ended up being really happy with it, and I really liked it, the result as well. Something that might be different is, in the same day I might get an ad where people are carrying groceries into the front of their house, and there's voiceover that says, "Are you hungry today?" And there's a fun sounding track underneath. And then the sound effects that I need to add to that, I just have to evaluate what's there first of all, and what is going to add to this value. Maybe it's the grocery bag, maybe it's the keys jangling. If there's a certain product that is the focus of this ad, then I need to make sure the sound of that is just totally perfect and is very clear. So those are two contrasting examples, but every project is different and needs a different approach. And so as soon as I get it, then I have to decide what that is.
Wow, that is really incredible. I mean, if you're doing like a movie or a short film, for instance, do you just sort of watch through the entire thing and get a notepad and say, okay, this rock moved here, we need a sound for that, and et cetera, et cetera? Is it kind of like that going through?
Yeah, it can be that granular.
Wow.
I've definitely read in kind of the old manual of how to do film sound, the spotting session, where you just sit down with the director and literally do that. At every second of the film, you write down what you want there. And that is sometimes done, but usually it's a little more vague. I'll get a film and it'll come with notes from the director that says, I want to feel this, highlight this here, make sure to bring this out. And so they'll give me some direction, and then I'll watch it and make my own notes that respect their vision, and I can imagine a way to achieve that. I don't get too granular usually, because if I know that this scene needs footsteps, I don't really need to mark down where every single footstep sound is going to go. I can go in and just kind of do that. I can improvise that a little bit, but I will make decisions such as this section will need very realistic sounds of people and Foley, and then maybe this section will need very cinematic, ethereal, and emotional sounds. I'll make those big broad choices at first.
Have you ever worked with a scene where there was a circumstance being portrayed where you weren't exactly sure what it was supposed to sound like something you'd never personally experienced before?
Yeah, definitely. Let's see, I did a movie about grandparents passing away, and there was some like oxygen tanks and some different medical devices that had a really particular sound. And so we have to just do research, go to YouTube, find somebody using one, and then try to recreate that sound usually, because those don't exist in a library. So I'll have to redesign it. Maybe it has a pump. I'll go find a pump and alter it and edit it to make it sound like what's on screen. And maybe it has a beep, and so I'll have to go recreate the beep. And so those things definitely happen. And then, the full variety of cars and motorcycles, and there's can be a large research component to editing something like that. I did a little action film, and they had a Piper Cub airplane, and they were very concerned that the sounds I used were from a Piper Cub airplane, because I think a lot of times there's some beautiful lies that happen in sound design sometimes, and the coolest sounding plane might be a World War II Mustang that goes zoom like over your head, but that is not at all accurate to that plane that's on screen. And sometimes you do that. There's a lot of times where you put in a more exciting sound to give the scene that energy, but sometimes you also need to be sensitive to when do we need to be very accurate and very real.
A major part of what you do is also guiding the emotions of the people that are watching a scene. How do you bring emotion into sound?
I think I get that from music. there's a lot of compositional elements that can be borrowed over into sound design. If things are happy, in music, you're typically going to have melodies that are working upwards. You're going to have lots of bright sounding instruments, cymbals and flutes and clarinets and trumpets. And if things are sad, they're typically going to move downward. You're going to have tubas and cellos and basses and deep bass drums. And I think in sound design, you can apply that same thing. You can bring out the sparkle of the sun and the birds chirping and leaves in the trees rustling, and maybe there's a cricket or something, and all those are very bright and high sounds that are pleasant to hear. In the opposite sense, if it's a dark scene, you have a low rumble, you have probably something cinematic, maybe just a low drone of sound. For that film I did recently about the coal miner, this community had been totally desolated by mountaintop removal mining. And so I made a point to not include any birds in the soundtrack. I wanted it to feel like wildlife hadn't left. And so something like that will give you an unconscious sense that something is not right here. I think birds in particular give people a sense of calm and home and safety. And so that was why I wanted to omit that. But it's also hard to put a finger on that and how to put a feeling to a scene, because one sound may work perfectly in this film, but if you try that same trick in another one, it doesn't work.
Wow. So when you have to bring music in to create a sort of feel, is that something that you're typically given by like a director that has worked with like a musician for a particular movie, or is that something you also have to create?
Most music these days is from a music library.
Interesting.
So something like MusicBed or Artlist or American Public Media, there's lots of different music libraries out there, and composers will upload their tracks, and then when you need something, you can just go and search for the mood and the style that you want and download it, and there you go.
Wow.
And so sometimes we're involved in the selection of that. Like our studio has a podcast, and so when we're producing our own show, we will go and do that same process, select it, and sometimes we'll compose ourselves. For advertisements and films and a lot of the client work that comes in, the music choices need to be made quickly, and the sound effects choices need to be made quickly, so that the video editor and the producer will typically decide those things and put them together. And when it comes to me, I'll have what's called an OMF, which will include a bunch of separate elements that are the music, the dialogue, any sound effects from set, maybe some production sound, and then some sound effects that they put in if they laid out some big hits that they want. And I'll use that as a guide, and then I'll edit everything and kind of remaster the music to fit with the spot and edit all the voices and process everything so that it sounds great, and do a lot of adding sound design. And the sound library is our in-house library, or something that I make custom for the spot. It always depends.
Going back to your previous discussion on bringing emotion into the sound, is that something that you just sort of have an innate feel for? Is that something that you can learn how to do?
I think it is, for sure. And probably the best way to learn it is by listening and observing previous work, whether that be any genre of music or any genre of film. Just watching and seeing how people did it is the best teaching tool, because it's so context based. You might notice that this particular set of sounds that one sound designer chose might be exactly the same set of sounds that another sound designer chose for a different movie, but they have a completely different feel. And I think that's sort of how I started translating my musical background into a sound design background, is that I would watch a film and start to think about what are the component parts of that sound that got the end result.
Now, when you watch movies and shows, are you able to do that without paying too much attention to the sound and getting distracted by what they decide to use?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. I think there's an old adage. It says, if the sound team has done their job right, you don't know that they are there. If we make sounds that are perfectly believable, then you should be carried away in the story. You shouldn't be thinking about the sound when you're watching it. You should be carried away, and we want to contribute to that. So if we've done our jobs right, then you don't notice us. But one of my personal pet peeves is, like, if I'm watching, say, Planet Earth or something like that, and a little animal is on screen and you can hear them eating. Sometimes that's cool, but also sometimes I can just hear a sound person on a microphone eating a chip. It's just so obviously that to me. Or when a little animal blinks, it's like, that doesn't make us. We don't need to hear that. And so sometimes that will take me out of the action.
Wow, that's hilarious.
And you want to put those things in there. You want to give that hyper real sense, and that's something else that sound can offer. If the camera is a mile away with a helicopter with a zoom lens, the only sound that would have been recorded is the drone or the helicopter sound that the camera is mounted to. So even on those nature documentaries, you have to put all those sounds back in, and so you can bring back that sense of reality where sound wasn't able to be captured before. And film sets are often like that. You need everybody to be quiet. You unplug the refrigerator in the domestic scenes. You have a generator running to turn the lights on when they're outside doing something dramatic. And so you have to replace all those sounds that don't work for the story with sounds that do work for the story. But yeah, sometimes I notice things where I'm like, oh, why did they put that sound in?
I guess that also works as like a learning moment for you as well.
Yes, it does. Another thing that happens is similar to the way that there are music libraries. I'll hear the same song get used over and over again in certain genres. But there's also sound effects libraries. So we make a lot of our own custom stuff, but we also buy sound libraries from a variety of places. And sometimes I'll hear, particularly with the popular libraries, I'll hear those sounds appear in a major show. And that also takes me out of the action. You peeked behind the curtain and it takes me out of the story for a minute. Like, oh, I know that's cinematic hit number 5. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I've seen that on a couple of sitcoms before where I'm like, oh, wait a second. This is like a huge deja vu. I remember this exactly in another show. And I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, somebody made this. And it kind of takes you out of the realism.
Yeah. And with the music library tracks, I think if you search around YouTube, you can find kind of compilations where people have found all the 40 different ads that use this same song and just cut between them all. And it's weird to watch.
So when you are creating new sounds, like for instance you watch through something, you say, okay, I need to make a sound of like a boot hitting something, for instance, or rocks clanging together. How do you know what to use to create those particular sounds that you're missing?
If I can put boots on and go walk around in the house or in the backyard and record it, I will do that, but I may not have access to specifically what is on screen. And so that's where sound libraries come in, and that's why we need to work with those. But sometimes it does come down to finding odd props around the house. Like I needed the sound of these really chunky Christmas lights. Somebody, stringing lights up around the house, and I needed to have a sound for that. And so what I ended up with was a Sharpie cap and my Apple headphones, and the way that those plastics kind of clicked together just sounded right. And so so I did a bunch of performing with those little props, and that ended up fitting in the scene. And it wasn't Christmas lights at all, but that's what ended up going in that video. So
oh my gosh. So do you just kind of say, hey, I've got this stuff laying around, let me just kind of clink it together and see if anything sounds right?
Yeah, I mean, you want to make your best guess, and
right.
Sometimes I know what's going to work. Sometimes you have to do that trial and error and find what is going to work and what's not.
That's really cool. I mean, I'd say that's a talent for sure, to be able to create sounds that sound like one thing, but they're created from totally different objects.
Well, thank you. I'll take it. I'll take that as a talent. It was actually a complete accident, really. I tried half a dozen other things, and that was the thing that finally worked and stuck. I think Mark Mangini said this. I hope I don't get this quote wrong. It was that one of the sound designers' greatest tools is like repurposing mistakes as genius and then taking credit for it. And so that there's a lot of that in sound design, trying things and discovering and put it to picture and see what the result is and see if it works or not. And when it works, you look like a genius, but it really was just maybe a random guess.
Yeah, well, definitely from my perspective, anything that is able to create an accurate atmosphere from just everyday household objects just looks like magic to me. So when you do create a sound like that, how much of that actual final product is the original sound you recorded, like the Apple headphones and the Sharpie cap, versus the final product with like all the digital alterations? Do you find that you change everything pretty drastically?
I'm going to say again, it depends. So for something like a documentary, I probably won't do as much creative sound design. There's usually a pretty extensive track from that actual place. And even if it doesn't sound the best, you want to preserve that kind of gritty realism. And so depending on genre, I may really tiptoe over the production sound and just add in just the little bits that it needs. Or for something else, if it's like an advertisement for a tennis shoe or a car and it's very shiny and very high end, then absolutely every single sound is replaced and polished and refined and processed.
Wow, that's really interesting. Just to have the final product and the vision of what the entire thing is supposed to be dictate to what extent something is digitally altered. But it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and one of the ways that I'm able to do that confidently is because I have such a great team of people that I get to work with, and we are always constantly sharing our work with each other and saying, "Does this sound cool? Is this believable?" And that's probably the most valuable thing I have, is that I have people to bounce ideas off of and get feedback from.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, you are creating environments for other people, so having that feedback, I'm sure, is definitely helpful.
Yeah, because I can get too excited about some special audio technique that I used, and then I share it with a fellow sound designer, and they say, what are you doing here? I don't get it, man. And so you go back to the drawing board.
What does a typical project for a sound designer look like? Where do you come in the process of a project? And what does that time frame look like for you as a sound designer?
We're usually at the end. For me, I work outside of Hollywood, so I don't really work on features. I work on a lot of short films. I work on a lot of advertising, a lot of trailers, and our own podcast, which is, I don't remember if I've said, 20,000 Hertz is our studio's podcast. And so a typical day in the morning, I'll come in and I'll have an advertisement to work on, and maybe that's a 30-second ad for a TV show. And so I'll have about 4 hours to take the different dialogue bites from the show and clean out any extra noise and make the tone of them sound like they all match together. And then same thing with the voiceover, and then layer in the music and level the music so that it all fits together, and then do any sound design that it may need. You know, if it's a show about gold mining, I'm going to have lots of rocks and sparkly gold dust sounds. Or if it's a show about fishing, then there's going to be tons of ocean and, you know, water and all these different things. So all those get added in and get mixed. And I have just a few hours to do that. Those typically have many variations. There's a 30-second and then a 15 and then a 5-second version of kind of the same material. And those have a short turnaround. So, you know, kind of 4 to 6 hours and the whole project is done. But it starts from that OMF file where I have a collection of the sounds that have already been decided, you know, the voices, the music, maybe a couple of sound effects. And then I refine all that and add all the additional sounds that need to be in there. And then for longer projects, it starts in a similar way. I get that OMF file with all the different elements, but I may have a week to do a short film instead of an afternoon. For those longer films, I think I follow what I think is a pretty conventional workflow from, you know, borrowed from film, Hollywood film. You know, where I'll do all of the dialogue editing, and then I'll do all of the Foley editing, and then I'll do all of the sound design, and then I'll do all of the mixing. I'll kind of divide the larger project up into those segments, because I think most of the audio world kind of thinks of projects divided up that way. And so even if I'm the only person working on it, I'll still try and divide up the work in that way.
Awesome. Do you have a favorite project you've ever worked on?
I have a bunch that stick with me. I really like the short films where you get time to dive into different ideas and sit with people's emotions, and, you know.
Do you have a favorite part about what you do?
One favorite part. I really love all of it. I feel extremely lucky to have the job that I have. If I had to pick one favorite part, maybe I would say I love speakers and listening, and I really am drawn to the technical stuff. That's not the majority of what I do, but I guess that's what I tend to do, in my time outside of work as well. I set up my home theater system in my living room and kind of get to sit back and really enjoy those favorite films and things like that. So I think that's my favorite part, but I really am happy doing every part of my job.
Geez, I mean, what a position to be in where you really have a passion that you've been able to turn into a career. That's really amazing.
Yeah, I feel incredibly lucky to have that. Leaving music school and kind of stopping playing, kind of leaving it behind was really scary. And I had a lot of family who said, "Are you sure about this? You just spent a lot of money on school and a long time studying, and you're just going to do something else?" I said, "Yeah, I think I am. I think I needed to make this jump."
Wow, well, it seems like it was very successful for you. So now that you've been in sound design and you sort of touched on it just now, do you still have like music and percussion as a hobby you do on the side still, or has being a sound designer made that a little bit more challenging?
I think I have to say no, I don't. I'm getting into a little bit more now. I'm trying to play a little bit of piano, and I definitely like to do composing to the extent that I need to at work and for the different projects I'm working on. But I don't have a drum set here. I don't have any instruments. I don't have a music studio set up. I just have my post-production studio. So sometimes I miss it, but also sometimes I am really glad that I can hit save and when I can hit the save button, and when I come back, the work is just the same.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was playing, percussion can be very, very physical. And so if you come in and your arms are tired and you haven't warmed up, it may take you an hour of warm up and kind of reconditioning your hands to get back to the same performance ability you had yesterday.
Wow.
And that was always very frustrating for me. And you push that envelope as you practice and as you study, and over time, your kind of base level of skill gets higher over time. Like I can still pick up some sticks and play a few things, but it was always a challenge. It was always really frustrating as a musician. And now I only lose work if, the hard drive crashes or something like that.
Yeah. So. Well, that's really interesting to hear your perspective on that, because you always sort of hear that people that have a career that very closely aligns with a previous passion and a route they originally thought they were going to take, you don't always see that the hobby and the career both carry through over time. You sort of see that one takes precedence over the other. So it's interesting to see how it's happened for you.
Yeah, I think I have definitely, I think I'm leaving my musical past behind more all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it comes back in waves. If we're, we just did a Halloween show about the Dies Irae, and so I got to pull out a lot of my music history knowledge and get to do a little bit of playing and composing for that episode. So that was a lot of fun.
Cool. So looking forward in your career, do you have a type of project that you'd really love to work on someday?
I think I would love to do a feature film someday. I as a kid and even now as a fan, I still always watch all the special features and, how did they make the sound of the lightsaber? I've watched every video I can find on that. And those sounds are so iconic and are so exciting and mysterious. And, what universe did this even come from? And especially with all these new movies that are coming out, and just what they can do with the visual effects. There's always more and more things to imagine and new sounds to imagine. And so I would feel like I completed my career if I designed a sound that inspired somebody else to get into sound, like those sounds did for me when I was watching the special features as a kid. I think I would feel like I had completed my career. But now as a professional, I know how hard it is to do that, and how really it gives me an even deeper appreciation for great sound design because it's not that hard to get going and make some sounds and make things exciting, but it's incredibly hard to make things that are really unique and really iconic.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to be able to understand that people created sounds from like a fantasy universe or something like Star Wars that then created that entire universe for you and made it real. It's pretty crazy to think that people could come up with stuff like that. So I do have a couple questions that I like to ask everybody that comes on the podcast to end. If you could choose any profession other than the one you currently have, and you didn't have to worry about money or going back to school or anything, what would you choose?
I think I would be a race car driver.
You were the second person that's been on here that said they wanted to be a race car driver. Oh my gosh, that's funny. So what's your thought behind that?
I just went to car shows all the time as a kid growing up, and it was just something that, was around, and I have an appreciation for the engineering side of it and the how precise they have to be with everything, just shaving grams off of every component of the car. And then I've got a little racing video game set up, and it's just exciting, get to race around. And I really like road racing and Formula One and the endurance GT car racing. I'm a big fan of those things. So yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why I'm drawn to it. It's just, I just think it's cool.
Yeah, it is cool. And what an adrenaline rush for sure. So the second question is, do you have any advice on how to turn your passions into a career?
Yeah, I think I do. I think I would say that the biggest challenge is going to be letting go of doing it just for the love of doing it and then having to do it on a calendar. And that's something I struggled a lot with in music at first. And then I struggled with it a little bit when I got into sound design, is that you just want to come in and follow your creativity in the direction that you want to go, but you may not get paid doing that. You need to please your clients. So I would say start that by sit down on a schedule, or with a framework for your passion, and do it regularly and do it like work, even if you're not doing it for work yet. And just keep at it, be patient, and you'll find a break one day. I think I learned a lot more than I realized having a parent who was in graphic design and seeing them do that work in a rush for somebody else's vision. And that's one of the biggest challenges when you finally get into commercial work, is that you have to find a way to love this activity without being too attached to the project. I think that's maybe why I left music ultimately. I would get bored with piece that I had to play, and just I couldn't love the process. I loved my choices in music, but I didn't love other people's choices in music. But with sound design, I haven't had that. I've been able to see other people's vision and enjoy that and try and add to it and make that the challenge. And so I think that's why I'm happy with my job.
It's an excellent perspective and something that is pretty rarely talked about, especially with creative fields and anything within like movies and film, short film, etc., is that everything that you're making is not yours unless you're like a rock star or something like that. But learning to love the process, I think, is what can tell you yourself that, hey, this is something that I actually do want to pursue as a career because I could love it no matter what. So it's really cool to hear your perspective on that.
It kind of clicked for me one day that think of your ultimate favorite movie and you watch the behind the scenes. That wasn't somebody's ultimate creative work from the beginning of their career. Like, they got a contract and they came in and did their day-to-day job, and what resulted was this thing that was so moving. And yeah, I realized it was a different outlook than I had approached it with. I kind of viewed art and creativity as this nebulous thing, and I think in reality it needs more of you need to be it and exist in that state and be able to turn it on a calendar, to be able to make it and do it as a job.
Wow, that's really, really solid advice, especially for the industry that you're in, and any creative industry for sure. Well, Nick, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today and learning about everything that you do. I just find sound design absolutely fascinating, and it was incredible to hear about you. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I hope I said something valuable.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Nick, links are in the description down below. If you like the show, please leave a rating, subscribe, and comment on whatever platform you listen on. It really helps out the show. For more information, you can find us on Instagram at The More Creative or on YouTube at The More Creative Podcast. Again, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time.